Picking up where we left off with the Carter administration and the things that were kind of destroying America's confidence, America's resolve, the Iranian hostage crisis. This is the big negative in the Carter presidency. Carter seems helpless. He seems hopeless to do anything against this hostage crisis. Again, the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the Shah led to the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini and an Islamic Republic in Iran, led to an oil embargo and these hostages being held for 444 days until January 20th, 1981, when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated president. Carter went on the radio and TV and basically blamed the American people for the problems of America. Now, as a politician, you don't come out and blame the people you're trying to convince to vote for you for re-election. It becomes known as the crisis of confidence speech. He says, our people are losing faith not only in government itself, but in the ability as citizens to serve as the ultimate rulers and shapers of democracy. But just as we are losing our confidence in the future, we are also beginning to close the door on our past. In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, by what one owns. Now, however true or whatever that may be, you cannot go as the President of the United States and inspire people with that kind of rhetoric. Basically, he's telling the American people, we've got problems and you're to blame for it. So it's no wonder Carter doesn't win re-election in 1980. During the 1970s, you saw the beginnings, the rise of what becomes known as the New Right. This is a conservative Christian movement, Southern movement. The moral majority, the Christian coalition with televangelists like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson promoting what they called traditional family values. They encouraged what were called values voters, and they used their mega churches and their television evangelical empires to get their message across, and they promoted what became known as culture wars. Going after abortion, trying to promote the family, laws and stipulations against gays, promoting prayer in public schools, trying to this was kind of a reaction to a lot of the excesses of the 1960s. So this was kind of the answer to it. And from 1980 to present, you've got the rise of the New Right, social conservatives, evangelical, pro-family value, patriotic, limited federal government. They were against judicial activism and promoted cultural issues, gays, education, women's lib, abortion, what become known as the culture wars. You had your fiscal conservatives who believed in industry deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy. These are your old school Republicans. And then political conservatives who were pro-military and anti-communist, wanted to promote law and order, pro-gun, and confront the Soviets. If you could find a candidate who could appeal to all three areas of this new right movement, you would have a governing majority, and that person was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan appealed to all aspects of the conservative movement. And in the election of 1980, with the funk of the Carter years, Ronald Reagan is going to win convincingly against Jimmy Carter in 1980. And Reagan is going to take America in a sharply different direction from what was essentially the old New Deal coalition and the liberal idea that government could solve a lot of your problems. Reagan says government can't solve your problems, government is the problem. And so it was Reagan who believed that getting government out of the way of business, out of the way of individuals, would promote a better America. So in that regard, Reagan is going to cut taxes and deregulate industry, very much the way that the Republicans did in the 1920s. Tax cuts for the rich, deregulation of business, and the belief that that would then trickle down to the people at the bottom. The problem was that Reagan and Congress never cut domestic spending. And so you cut the stream of income coming into the government, but you never cut the spending, and as a result, deficits soared. The deficits that Reagan incurred in his 8 years of being president were more than the previous 39 presidencies combined. The deficit in 1981 was about $1 trillion. By the end of Reagan's presidency, it was a little north of $4 trillion. Reagan also confronted the Russians, what he called the evil empire. He wasn't interested in deals. He wasn't interested in détente like Nixon was, like Ford was, or Carter. Reagan believed in confronting the Russians wherever they were. And using the word evil, he's appealing to the morality of the conservative movement and is able to rally people to his cause. He proposes a strategic defense initiative, what becomes known as Star Wars. This was a missile defense system to shoot down Soviet missiles. The Russians feared that this would give the Americans an edge in what could be possibly a first strike capability for the Americans. So the Russians are going to start funding their own strategic defense initiative. And eventually the Russians are going to choose as their leader a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, who realizes that he needs to change the Soviet system in Russia. When Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Russians, Reagan and Gorbachev are able to work together. Gorbachev promotes what's called glasnost and perestroika, openness and free market economy. It's going to fundamentally change the way that Russians and the Soviet Union do business. And from 1985 to 1989, the American and Russian relationship is going to warm up, get better. Reagan is eventually going to make deals with Gorbachev in order to limit the risk of nuclear war, not increase it. In 1984, the economy was booming. Tax cuts had stimulated the economy. People were making money. The American military was back. America felt good about itself. Reagan called it morning in America. And in 1984, the American people overwhelmingly re-elected Ronald Reagan in the election against Carter's former vice president, Walter Mondale. Now, the one interesting thing about the election of 1984 is that it marked the first time a woman was on the ticket, and this was Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman on a major party ticket. But, as we all know, second terms stink, and in 1986 it is revealed that the Reagan administration, contrary to their stated policy, had traded arms for hostages that were being held in the Middle East at the behest of the Iranian regime, and that the Reagan administration got caught in a lie. Now, this takes a little bit of explaining to do, but America during the 1980s was funding anti-communist groups here in Central America. Some of these groups were not very friendly, not very nice. For instance, in Nicaragua, there was a group called the Contras. Now, these were anti-communist groups, but they were very violent, they were very unpredictable, and so Congress actually banned Reagan from providing financial aid directly to the Contras. So as a result, Reagan decided he was going to try to kill two birds with one stone. America, in order to try to get hostages out of Lebanon in the Middle East that were being held by terrorist organizations funded by Iran, America is going to try this really crazy deal. We are going to ship arms and equipment to Israel. which should have shocked nobody since Israel was the #1 recipient of arms and financial aid from the United States. Now, those arms shipments that go through Israel are then funded to Iran. Now, Iran, between 1980 and 1988, is fighting a war with its neighbor, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein. America is openly funding Saddam Hussein and Iraq, but quietly and secretly, we're also funding the Iranian regime that hates our guts. In exchange, every time an arms shipment is received in Iran, a hostage goes free from Lebanon. And when Iran pays for the arms that it's receiving, the money goes back to Israel, and from Israel, it goes to the Contras in Latin America. This is a clear violation of the law. It's a clear violation of Reagan's stated policy that we would never trade arms for hostages. And when it's revealed that the American government was doing this, there was actually talk of possibly impeaching Ronald Reagan. Under Reagan, there are other despite the fact that it was morning in America, it was morning in America for some, not for all. Poverty increases under the Reagan administration's fiscal policies. The gap between the rich and poor grows and has continued to grow for the past 30 years. Deficits increase when you do not have the tax stream coming into the government and you continue to spend. Deficits are going to go up. Homelessness increases as Great Society programs are defunded and gotten rid of under the Reagan administration. Poverty, homelessness, and a number of other things are going to increase. AIDS, which was brand new in the 1980s, a new disease, goes unchecked, mainly because the Reagan administration believed that it was a disease that was just in the gay community. They didn't see it as a widespread pandemic, and by the time they discovered that it was a major health concern, it was way too late. And the division between blacks and whites is going to increase during the 1980s. A lot of inner city blacks are ignored. You've got a drug epidemic, the crack epidemic, the gang epidemic that is occurring in the inner cities, and it's basically being ignored by the folks in Washington. African Americans that had experienced progress in the 1960s under the Johnson administration are going to experience serious setbacks. There had been busing going on to try to encourage educational equality with black and white students. Black students were being bused into white communities. White students were being bused into black communities. In Prince George's County, that occurred in the early 1970s. In Charlotte, Mecklenburg, it occurred in the 1970s. But the Supreme Court is going to strike down the legitimacy of that policy in Swan versus Charlotte, Mecklenburg, in Bakke versus the Board of Regents of the University of California. The idea of affirmative action is going to be challenged. That colleges cannot have racial quotas when it comes to college acceptances. And again, affirmative action is being challenged today. Just 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court, in a Michigan case, upheld the limits to affirmative action when it came to picking and choosing students who go into college. You're seeing white flight continue from the cities to the suburbs. The Reagan administration is going to cut funding for a number of poverty programs. The crack epidemic continues unabated. Crime rates and the number of unwed mothers increases. You're seeing a deterioration of the breakdown of the family in these inner cities. A lot of the men wind up going to jail in this very strict 3 strikes and you're out policy. A lot of people wind up with criminal records. A lot of people believe it's kind of a new type of segregation. And the inner city blight of housing, the failures of public housing that had been started with the noblest of intentions under the Johnson administration. A lot of this public housing is going to fall into disrepair. In the election of 1988, Vice President George Bush is going to run essentially as a third term of Ronald Reagan and wins convincingly with a promise to read his lips. He was not going to raise taxes. And the Bush presidency has got some ups, it's got some downs. You've got the end of the Cold War during the Bush presidency in 1989, and Bush wisely chooses not to do a celebratory dance on the remnants of the Berlin Wall. He steps back, allows the Soviet Union to dissolve peacefully. When Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in 1990 in order to gain access to the oil fields to help fund the war that he had just fought against the Iranians from 1980 to 88, the Bush administration is going to put together an international coalition created by the United Nations, a coalition of more than 50 countries to send troops into Kuwait to drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. It is called Operation Desert Shield, and when it becomes a full-fledged war, it becomes Operation Desert Storm. The war lasts 100 hours. It's America's quickest, fastest, most successful war. George Bush was riding high with a 90% approval rating at the end of the Gulf War, should have won re-election in a romp, but unfortunately what happened to Bush is that a recession occurred in 1990, and Bush was blamed for the recession, even though it wasn't really his fault. He had, as a matter of fact, hatched a deal with the congressional Democrats to raise taxes, raise revenues, to help meet a lot of the deficit program, a lot of the deficit that had occurred. And in large regard, it was Bush's tax increase in 1990, breaking his no new taxes pledge, that led to the economic recovery of the 1990s and the great economy that you had that Bill Clinton gets the credit for. In the election of 1992, Bush is blamed for the bad economy. He never recovers. Bill Clinton and Ross Perot, as a third-party candidate, campaign against Bush. Perot siphons off a lot of the fiscal conservatives who were upset at Bush's breaking of the no new taxes pledge. And with only 43% of the popular vote, Bill Clinton wins the presidency in the election of 1992. As you can see here, it was Perot's vote that drew a lot of the votes away from George H.W. Bush, and George H.W. Bush serves only one term. Now, Clinton comes into office promoting free trade, promoting a program called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, to open up trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It's going to encourage the idea of dropping trade barriers around the world, encouraging free trade. And yes, it's going to benefit merchants, it's going to benefit stocks, it's going to benefit businesses. But what it does is it encourages American businesses to ship their jobs to places where there's cheaper labor. And that's where you're going to start to see a huge sucking sound of jobs being sucked out of the United States. Clinton suffers from a number of woes in his first term. He places his wife Hillary in charge of health care reform that goes nowhere. He tries to institute a national health care program. The American people didn't like the way it was conducted. They didn't like the way Clinton was conducting his first 2 years in office. And in 1994, the Republicans win a landslide congressional election led by Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich, promising what he called a contract with America, and as an alternative to programs. Clinton was also racked by scandal. There were a number of scandals that enveloped the Clinton presidency. They all kind of fall under the aegis of something called Whitewater. But Whitewater encapsulated a number of different scandals within the Clinton administration, most notably a sexual harassment charge levied by a former Arkansas state employee named Paula Jones. When Clinton had been governor of Arkansas, he was charged with sexual harassment. Yet, in his second 2 years in his first term, 95 and 96, Clinton is able to achieve a number of victories by working with the Republicans in Congress. He achieved sweeping welfare reform. That's his big notable achievement in his first term. Funding for the Human Genome Project to map the human genome. The dot-com craze and the computer revolution take off. The internet takes off in the 1990s. And you have the greatest economy since the 1950s. Clinton is able to balance the budget, working with Republicans, able to balance the budget for 3 years and wound up with a surplus of $1 trillion by the end of his presidency. So there's a lot that you can look at where Clinton is able to actually get a lot accomplished. But what most people know Clinton for, and there's his reelection in 1996, what we'll call the comeback kid. And most people counted Bill Clinton down and out in 1994 when the Republicans took control of Congress. But Clinton was able to turn that around by 1996, and he and Al Gore won re-election, beating Bob Dole. Yet in his second term, Bill Clinton faces the impeachment over the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and the scandal was not the actions of the president, it was the lying under oath in the sexual harassment lawsuit of Paula Jones when asked if he was having extramarital affairs with anybody else, including word had leaked out that he was having an extramarital affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Bill Clinton lied about it under oath. That is committing perjury. Now, whether that rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors, who knows? But the Republicans in Congress, who always saw Bill Clinton as an illegitimate president, are going to use that as an excuse to try to impeach the president and remove him from office. It backfires on the Republicans, and Bill Clinton's popularity actually soars as a result of the impeachment scandal. He survives the impeachment scandal and continues with the rest of his term. In the election of 2000, Al Gore, Bill Clinton's vice president, tries to continue Bill Clinton's legacy. The Republicans nominate Texas governor with a familiar name, George Bush. This is George W. Bush. And the notability of the election of 2000 is in the closeness. It comes down to Florida, and nobody knew who won Florida. The vote was very close. Al Gore asked for a recount. They started recounting the votes, but unfortunately it was a long and cumbersome process for Gore. The recount was taking longer than there was time to certify the vote. And eventually, the Supreme Court steps in. Bush wanted to have the recount stopped at the deadline for the certification of the election, and the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore on a 5-4 vote sides with George Bush and orders the Florida recount stopped. When the recount is stopped, Bush had 537 more votes in Florida than Al Gore. He won all 25 electoral votes. And in the election of 2000, even though Al Gore won 500,000 more popular votes nationwide, George W. Bush becomes the president of the United States. Most people believe that the George W. Bush presidency wouldn't amount to very much. But then 9/11 occurred, and that's what made George W. Bush really the president. As a result of the 9/11 attacks, Bush is going to conduct a global war on terror. He passes the USA Patriot Act that allows the government to snoop through private information. The Department of Homeland Security is created, and the U.S. is going to invade Afghanistan to go after Al Qaeda and the Taliban government that supported them. And the U.S. is going to invade Iraq in 2003 to go after The Saddam Hussein regime, whom the Bush administration believed was building weapons of mass destruction. The whole onus of the global war on terror raises the question about privacy and security in the face of national security. And as we've seen before, in this instance, national security trumps privacy and civil liberties all the time. Bush's second term, he's reelected in 2004, defeating John Kerry and John Edwards. Bush's second term has a number of problems, as we know. Second terms stink for everybody, and George Bush's second term is about as bad as you can get, with Hurricane Katrina and his seeming lack of action there. His attempt to reform Social Security fails in 2005. Immigration reform fails. The Iraq War devolves into an unpopular war with no end in sight, with Bush getting blamed for that. And in 2008, you have the beginning of the Great Recession on Bush's watch, the greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression. It's against the backdrop of a 26% approval rating for George W. Bush in 2008 that Barack Obama is elected the first African-American president of the United States, and Barack Obama, of course, goes on to pass the Affordable Health Care Act, or Obamacare, which, say what you will, is popular or unpopular in certain circles. And what does the future hold for America? Who knows? But that is the end of content for APUS and pretty much everything you need to know. Take care.